Welcome, everybody. I'm Alex Nargis, the director of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and thank you all for being here tonight for yet another wonderful lecture. The star for tonight is a curator who joined us 12 years ago. I was wrong when I said 13. I'm sorry. I got my facts straight because somebody said, Alex, you made another mistake. And I'm thinking, well, it's been 5 minutes since the last one, so we're good. I got to tell you, Sarah came to the museum as an assistant curator of modern and contemporary art, responsible for our early 20th century European holdings, as well as then working in other areas of modern and contemporary art. And let me give you a little background about her, because she joined us in 2011, and of course, thankfully, I can do math, and that's how I got to 12 tonight instead of 13 the other day. Got her BA from Valparaiso University, and then her master's and her PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She also was a Luce Fellow, and then in 2011 came here. Now, what didn't strike me until tonight when I thought about what I would say about Sarah, other than she's brilliant and she's got a fabulous eye, she's tenacious, is that she's now done her second mega exhibition. But the tie between the two of them is because the central figures have been Richmonders. The first, Louis Draper, if you remember the Camoinge show from a couple of years ago, it won accolades in the art world, art history world, the art criticism world. It traveled to the Whitney, where the art world finally realized, oh, there's a big exhibition, and oh, wait a minute, it's about a bunch of New York photographers, but it was done by a museum where? In Richmond, Virginia. Because Louis Draper had to leave Richmond, Virginia as a young black photographer because he couldn't get work. He was unable to do that. He had to move to New York. And, you know, unfortunately, Louis Draper never got the due during his lifetime, founding the Camoinge Workshop. But I saw the show. I was there for the opening at the Getty in Los Angeles, richest museum in the world. They do fabulous. They have one of the 2 or 3 best collections of photography in the world, and they do fabulous exhibitions. But they took Sarah's show, and LA could not be more proud of what the Getty was doing. And then they realized, oh, wait a minute, I guess it's this museum in Virginia. But the tie was that Benjamin Wigfall, also from Richmond, and also a young black man who couldn't have a career here as an artist. In fact, when she'll tell you maybe the part of the story that to me was most fascinating, and the book, by the way, you got to get the book. You got to read it. It's absolutely, it's riveting. It's beautiful, and it's another accolade for Sarah. But he's going to high school, young man with talent, going to a segregated black-only school. There are no art teachers. And he worked with somebody, a couple of people at the Department of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia to see if they could get an art teacher in the school. I mean, that's how tenacious Ben Wigfall was. And that by itself is a story that's been long overdue to be told. But I want to say thank you to Sarah for bringing justice in the world of art history and the spotlight of 2 amazingly brilliant artists who, during their lifetimes, never got the recognition they deserved by any degree. But now, because of Sarah's effort, all the efforts of our colleagues here at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, for all of your support, we're able to finally shed the light on people like Benjamin Wigfall and give them the credit they've long deserved. And so to Sarah, thank you, and thank you for everything you do here.
Thank you, Alex. That was too kind. we didn't talk beforehand, but I was going to dedicate this lecture tonight to the art educators. And so I want to say some of the same names, but I want to acknowledge Celeste Feta, who is the art educator assigned to this exhibition, but is also our director. She has a longer title than that. Director of Art Education here at VMFA, but the entire education department has been a joy to work with, and really caught on early that so much of this story is about championing art education. And the story of Benjamin Wigfall is about an artist and an arts educator. And it has been an incredibly collaborative process. So despite all of the credit that Alex has just given me, the only reason these exhibitions have worked the way they've worked is because I have had an incredible community to work with, and I've had a lot of support at this museum. So Alex and Michael Taylor, our deputy director, and Valerie Cassell Oliver, my boss, and the senior curator have been incredibly supportive to give me the resources that I have needed to be able to do these exhibitions. But this one, Benjamin Wigfall and Communications Village, emerged from several communities because Benjamin Wigfall was beloved across 4 primary communities. He was born and raised here in Richmond, Virginia, in Church Hill, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. He then attended Hampton University and then was a professor at Hampton University. He then moved to the State University of New York, New Paltz, where he was a professor of printmaking. And then he founded Communications Village in Kingston, Virginia. And he was beloved in all of those communities. And all of those communities worked together to make this exhibition happen. So the Dorsky Museum, the Samuel Dorsky Museum at SUNY New Paltz, organized this exhibition in partnership with us, and they opened the exhibition in September and it closed in December. And that gave us a chance to meet the community in New Paltz and in Kingston, which was phenomenally helpful for the research and completing the book. And I want to acknowledge my co-curator, Drew Thompson, who came to me with this project in, I think it would have been 2021, if I'm remembering correctly. The Dorsky Museum had decided they wanted to do an exhibition to honor Benjamin Wigfall, and they actually had they selected Drew Thompson through a committee of people that were looking for curators to tell the story, and they were thinking primarily about Communications Village. And then Drew Thompson reached out to me, and we started talking, and we realized there really are 2 parts to this story, and they're extremely interwoven. There's Virginia, and there's New York, and the more we realized how much Benjamin Wigfall's experience here was a part of what he founded at Communications Village in New York, the more it seemed to make sense to have a partnership and to tell this complete story. So tonight I'm going to focus more on Virginia and Richmond. I will talk about Communications Village towards the end tonight, but I'm going to really hone in on the Richmond, Virginia, and the Hampton University portion tonight. So with that, this is the painting that Benjamin Wigfall is most known for and beloved at VMFA, for good reason. He was the youngest artist to have a painting acquired, or any work of art acquired by VMFA in 1951 when he was only 20 years old. So I am now going to tell the story of how he came to VMFA and how this happened, because I really can't think of another artist who is more woven through the warp and weft of the 2 missions at VMFA, which are art, but also education, and he was a part of both here. So first of all, a photograph of Benjamin Wigfall from 1953. This was his senior portrait for Hampton University. And this is a wonderful moment to thank Gia Wigfall Okibello and Gino Wigfall, Benjamin Wigfall's son and daughter, who are here with us tonight. I'm so grateful. In addition to the 4 works you'll see tonight that VMFA acquired in the 1950s, we worked with Gia and Gino to acquire 55 more works for VMFA. 36 of those are works by Benjamin Wigfall, and another 19, if I'm doing my math correctly, or works by members of his community that he invited to Communications Village. And then Gia and Gino gifted us their father's archive. So this is a photograph from their archive, which you're going to see throughout this lecture and you're going to see throughout the exhibition. And I also want to thank our archivists in the audience, Courtney Takesi, our senior archivist, and Noelle Johnson, our National Endowment for the Humanities archives intern, who cataloged this archive at an astounding speed and have helped me answer so many questions. So I may give them shout outs throughout. So this is a photograph of Benjamin Wigfall's mother, Willie Kogina Wigfall, and she's standing in front of their home on 27th and M Street, which is actually one of the oldest homes in Church Hill, which is already a very historic neighborhood in Richmond, in Church Hill. And I think the photograph was probably taken in the early 1970s. And I want to thank another person, which is Vita Jennings. She is Benjamin Wigfall's niece, and she spent the summers working in her aunt's beauty salon, which was behind their home on 27th Street. And when I gave a talk with Linda Holmes, another community member from Hampton in 2017, she heard us talking about his mother's beauty salon and remembered that she had the beauty salon sign that Benjamin Wigfall painted. So she allowed us to photograph it, and she shared many family photos with us, which really added, and you'll see these works in the exhibition, so I want to thank her for sharing. And then this is probably one of his earliest works of art. I don't know when he painted it. We're going to guess probably around the 1940s, but this would have hung in the breezeway between their two houses. And a lot of Benjamin Wigfall's memories of growing up in Church Hill involve his mother's beauty salon. He attended George Mason Elementary School in Church Hill, and one of the other interesting aspects of this story is that he was best friends with Douglas Wilder. So most of you are from Virginia. I know we're live streaming. Not everybody's from Virginia, but Douglas Wilder was the first African-American governor of Virginia, and they grew up within blocks of each other. Douglas Wilder lived on P Street. They're lettered and numbered streets in Church Hill, on P and 28th, and Benjamin Wigfall grew up on 27th and M, and George Mason School would have been in between them. And I had the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to interview Benjamin Wigfall in 2016, and he talked about Douglas Wilder being his best friend, but he said, I don't know if he'd say the same. And then Douglas Wilder came to that talk we gave in 2017 and agreed to let our museum leader in training program, those are teenagers who do a project here every year at the museum, he sat for an interview with them. And it was incredible because even though by then Benjamin Wigfall had passed away, Douglas Wilder had the other half of all of these stories. So they weren't in the same room together, but their stories were absolutely entwined. And that illustrated what Benjamin Wigfall had said. He said, I almost need Douglas Wilder sitting here. He called him Doug. I almost need Doug here sitting next to me because they shared so many memories. And they also then attended Armstrong High School, which at that time was not in Church Hill, it was in Jackson Ward, which is very much a part of the story of the Chimneys painting because they had to they both recalled that their parents would give them trolley fare for one way, but not both ways, and they were usually late in the morning, so they'd take the trolley to school, but then they would have to walk it's a good long walk back in the evening. And when I show you a slide of Chimneys again, you can imagine them walking home from high school in the evening, and Benjamin Wigfall said he would see these chimneys, and he talked about their sort of nobility and the way that they whispered in the evening. And then Doug Wilder looked at the same painting and said, that was the chimney for the trash incinerator. So you had a politician's view and you had an artist's view of the same. And aren't we glad that we have artists and politicians? But what Benjamin Wigfall remembers about Armstrong High School is that he already loved to draw and he loved art, but he didn't have a regular art teacher, and he campaigned for his principal to hire an art teacher, and he did not get one until the second half of his senior year, and he, to this day, in every interview, credited him by name as Stafford Evans. And he recalls that one of the first things Stafford Evans did was take him to VMFA. So I want to thank Celeste again, because she found this image of Stafford Evans, which I didn't have when we were working on the book. This is from a newspaper announcing Stafford Evans' new hires within Richmond, and it actually matches up with the fact that he was teaching at Baker Elementary in the fall and he was teaching at Armstrong in the spring, which matches with Benjamin Wigfall's memory. And he just remembers that Stafford Evans, he said, I just about latched on to him, let him go home and go through his records with him, and he just let him become a part of his life, which is what he needed at that moment as he was learning art. And at VMFA, Stafford Evans connected him with what were then segregated art classes. But those classes were aimed for ages 6 to 12, and by then Benjamin Wigfall was 17. So he remembers, and I'll show you another slide in a moment, a woman named Mary Godfrey who took him under his wing and let him wander through the museum since he was really too old for the classes. And the museum became a place that he visited regularly. But what he remembers most is this painting. And again, pretty much every interview he remembers this specific painting. He remembered seeing a painting by Lionel Feininger at VMFA, and that was his discovery of abstraction as an art form, and it changed the way he saw. And I want to again thank Courtney Takeizi, because she's the one who figured out it was this very painting. I knew when he told me in 2016 that he saw Lionel Feininger that we did not have one in the collection. But Courtney went through our American painting biennials and figured out that in 1948, in the spring of 1948, which is when he remembered being here, we had a painting called Moonwake by Lionel Feininger on view. And it makes perfect sense because when you look at it, it matches with the way he described his experience. He talked about seeing that painting and then leaving, and as he was catching the bus, he saw the reflection of the city windows in the window of the bus, and when he saw that, he thought of the Lionel Feininger, and he says, and he snapped his fingers, that he understood abstraction and how it could be both real and abstract at the same time, and abstraction became his primary visual language for the rest of his life. He worked a little bit in figuration, as you'll see in a few more slides, but primarily he worked in abstraction. This is an example. This is 1940, probably about 1949. This is figurative. This is one of the works he then turned in. In 1949, he applied for a Virginia Museum fellowship to attend Hampton University. This is his application. Again, thank you, Courtney, for finding our incredibly rich archive of fellowship applications, which included his photograph. And he went on to win 2 fellowships officially, but his 3rd fellowship he was turned down for, most likely because the museum had a policy that they were only going to give 2 fellowships. This was fairly early. The fellowship program began in 1940, and this was 1949. But the museum, he was so beloved at the museum, and he had so impressed the museum leadership, including the director of the museum at the time, Leslie Cheek, that they actually supported him with an anonymous fellowship for his 3rd year at attending Hampton University. And that he didn't get to know who his anonymous donor was, but it was John Lee Pratt, who was the founder of the fellowship program. And it was Leslie Cheek, the director, who was writing directly to Pratt to recommend that he support Benjamin Wigfall. And something that I think, this is really for the art educators, something that I think is incredibly important is that he credited, again, in many different interviews, Mary Godfrey. So this is a quote. Incidentally, all of this was worked out for me by another woman who was at that time working for the state, Mary Godfrey. And we found a letter in the archive from Mary Godfrey in 1953, and which caused us to dig deeper and try to figure out who she was. She was the Assistant State Supervisor of Art Education, and she had been hired by a woman named Sarah Joyner. And this, I think, helps to understand how VMFA is different as a state museum. We are literally a state agency, and we were founded as a state museum, only one of 3 in the country and by far the largest, and the first to be founded in the 1930s, before even the National Gallery of Art was founded as a federal museum in Washington, D.C. And part of the reason we could justify being a state museum was because the education mission was so strong, and because we came under the branch of education within the state. Part of our obligation was to share educational resources across the entire state. So it was a group called the Virginia Art Alliance, which was primarily made up of art educators as well as some other directors of smaller art institutions. They were there to advocate for the ways in which art resources could be shared around the state. So the ways VMFA might lend objects, but also the way it would share all kinds of educational resources. And so one of the things the Virginia Art Alliance advocated for was the hiring of a state supervisor for art education. And this is the woman that was first hired, Sarah Joyner. And what's incredible when you read the annual reports from this time is how excited they were about art education, how new art education was as a field, and how this was the professionalization of art education. And one of the things that she really emphasized, Sarah Joyner talked quite a bit about, was they were not trying to make young artists. They were trying to help people see differently, especially trying to help expand the way that children saw. So by learning art, and their definition of art was broad, they could see the world differently. And you can think about Benjamin Wigfall seeing the Lionel Feininger painting and then all of a sudden understanding abstraction. But the other thing that Sarah Joyner immediately stated in her first annual report was that she had surveyed art education across the state and that there was a vast inequality between art education possibilities, teachers, classes in the white schools versus almost no classes available within the segregated black schools within Virginia. And so she advocated to hire Mary Godfrey as the assistant state supervisor, and together their job was to go out to the schools and convince principals to hire educators and to convince the state to support art education. And so while Benjamin Wigfall thought it was something of a miracle that Stafford Evans was hired the second semester of his senior year, the years actually line up, and it is most likely, most possible that Mary Godfrey actually hired Stafford Evans. And then what's incredible is that he remembered that Mary Godfrey was there at the museum when he was too old for those classes. It was Mary Godfrey who received him. And I think perhaps even more incredible, he said in his interview with me in 2016 that because she let him wander through the museum, segregation didn't bother him while he was having those experiences at VMFA, which is another aspect of VMFA, and I will talk more about it as I go along, which is that even though it was a state agency, it actually didn't officially segregate until the 1950s in the midst of Brown versus Board of Education and the surveillance and pressure the state put on enforcing segregation. So another thing that comes up through Benjamin Wigfall's VMFA fellowship is his letter of recommendation in his first letter from George H. Ben Jonson. And this is George H. Ben Jonson's painting in the collection, which was acquired by the museum in 1945. And George H. Ben Jonson was one of the first 3 African-American artists that the museum had collected. So it's also significant to recognize the community of Black artists and educators around Benjamin Wigfall who were supporting him during this period. And one of the things that sort of emerged out of our research is what a role George H. Ben Jonson had played, more than I had realized, in Benjamin Wigfall's career, because between Armstrong and going to Hampton, we also learned that he had had several epileptic seizures, and this meant that he had to return home from Hampton. He'd started in 1948. He had to come home, and he couldn't return again until 1949. And one of his other letters of recommendation is from his doctor, who is, talking about the sort of fortitude he had in the face of this challenge. But he did not waste any time. He appears to have sought out George H. Ben Jonson, who would have been one of the most prominent African-American artists in the community, who, as you can see from the letterhead, advertised himself as a cartoonist. And he had begun as a cartoonist for The Planet, the African-American newspaper in the community, and he made very critical and cartoons. He did not mince words or images about segregation, lynching, and the kind of oppression, but he also was a proponent of understanding African culture and heritage. So this is a painting that George H. Ben Jonson painted in 1928, 2 years before Benjamin Wigfall was born. But in 1948, the year that we know that Benjamin Wigfall was working with George H. Ben Jonson, he was actually making these note cards in which he was taking his paintings and he was pairing them with histories of African culture and African art. So the exhibition itself does not talk about Benjamin Wigfall's later complete commitment and love of African art, but as Gia and Gino know, that was a major part of his later career. And so it's also just interesting to see those seeds planted early on, as early as 1948. And George H. Ben Jonson wasn't just in the collection. This is an exhibition from 1948 where these artists are in the newspaper because they have their work on view. So this George H. Ben Jonson is one of the artists at VMFA in this caption. And the other artist who's with him is Leslie, well, there's several artists, but the other African-American artist who's a part of this is Leslie Garland Bowling. Also significant because he had the first work of art. It was the first work by an African-American artist to enter the collection in 1944. This work actually was on view, though, when the museum opened in 1936. Shortly after opening, VMFA held a Virginia Artist Biennial. They took that from the Richmond Academy, and they held them first every year and then every other year. And so it was also significant to recognize these small spaces that VMFA had, even though this was an incredibly segregated state and it was a state agency. In their opening year, they were already showing African-American artists. And one of the reasons it's important to recognize that is because both Leslie Garland Bowling and George H. Ben Jonson were doing so much within the community to try to increase the opportunities for the next generation of African-American artists coming up behind them. They both attended Hampton, now University, then Hampton Institute, but before Hampton had an art department, so they didn't have a chance to have formal art education. So they were somewhat self-taught. But they were a part of the founding of the Craig House Art Center in Richmond, which we know a good bit about mostly from newspaper articles and then from the director of VMFA, the founding director, Thomas Colt Jr., who advocated to the board that when we began the fellowship program, at least one recipient of the VMFA fellowship should teach at the Craig House Art Center. And he actually got significant pushback from one of the board members, Jesse Ball DuPont, who wrote a very racist letter to him about why she didn't want funding from the museum to go. And he wrote back and he listed all the places in Virginia where a white student or an adult, really of any age, could get art classes. And it was a page-long list of all of the places that a white student could receive art education, and they then had an impassioned plea that the Craig House Art Center was the only place that an African-American student at that time could get an art education. And he himself knew that because he'd given a lecture there and he talked with the students, and then he didn't tell Jessie Ball DuPont this, but it's clear from our own records that he actually lent a VMFA exhibition of another artist to the exhibitions that they were holding at Craig House Art Center, and was generally active in the community at the Craig House Art Center. But this was a WPA project, essentially. It opened in 1938 with WPA funds, and it closed in 1941 when the WPA, Works Progress Administration funds, ran out. So it's not a place that Benjamin Wigfall had the opportunity, he was 9 when it closed, had a chance to take classes at. But I'm spending so much time talking about it because I think it's really significant in thinking about George H. Ben Jonson and bowling and the roles they played in increasing access, and then moving forward, thinking about Benjamin Wigfall and what he did with Communications Village, himself as an artist later in life. And then another artist that he would have seen on view at VMFA was Samela Sanders Lewis, who was at the time when we acquired this painting as a long-term loan in 1944, a student of Elizabeth Catlett's at Hampton University. Because by 1943, Hampton had founded an art department, and it really became, in the 1940s, what Benjamin Wigfall defined as the best art department in the South, period. And we know he would have seen this work on view from this installation photo of Samela Sanders Lewis' work in the American galleries, which is dated somewhere between 1948 and 1951. And this is exactly the time period when Wigfall had a fellowship. And part of the fellowship involved some sort of job. So either you taught, or one of the jobs was to make posters for the museum. And again, I'm going to credit Courtney Takeizi for her really keen eye. In this newspaper article, Benjamin Wigfall, this is also the local news back in the 40s, he gets his own article, Student Home for Holidays, Thrilled by Art Museum Task. So he is seen here not only, we presume, screen printing, possibly even designing the poster based on his letters back and forth with Leslie Cheek. But what he's holding, and this is what Courtney noticed, is a Alexander Calder poster. And I don't think any of us think of Alexander Calder as a controversial artist. But if it helps you understand Richmond in 1949, the Calder exhibition was in fact controversial. It upset a lot of people, and as Muriel Christensen says, she got called a communist. Because abstract art was that of the northern elites, and a number of Richmonders didn't like being told that this was art when they didn't understand it, which is exactly why she explained that it was clear to her that this is why it was important, exactly why it was important to have an Alexander Calder show in 1949 in Richmond, Virginia. But I think it's incredible to think the fact that abstraction was so new at VMFA. So when Benjamin Wigfall saw that painting by Lionel Feininger, that was the very first year he could have seen an abstract painting at VMFA, because it was also the year that we acquired the T. Catesby Jones collection of French modernism. And in fact, the board president then tried to prevent the director, Tom Colt at the time, from even showing abstract art in the biennials, because he thought that it wouldn't be received well by Richmond. And he turned out to be right, because in 1950, when Stuart Davis's work Champion was included among many other incredible, when you look at the checklist for the 1950 juried biennial, it was the American Painting Show, it is now the canonical show of abstract expressionism. You have Jackson Pollock, you have Gottlieb, you have de Kooning. It's an incredible checklist of artists, and among those was Stuart Davis. And when the museum voted to acquire Stuart Davis's painting, Little Giant Still Life, it again set off all kinds of controversy in the newspaper. People very upset. not sure how many people were actually upset versus how much the editorial writers were kind of using this to increase readership. Also, apparently, it increased attendance at VMFA because people were really interested in finding out what was going on. But I think it's just significant to think about Benjamin Wigfall, age 20, seeing all of this abstraction for the first time, being so receptive to it, adopting it, and then by the time this is 2.5 years since he first saw Lionel Feininger's work, he has his own abstract painting in VMFA. And it's through a juried Virginia biennial, and it is in fact Stuart Davis, who had caused all the controversy, who had been on the jury, because Leslie Cheek, the director, then did not mind controversy. So he just pressed in, asked Stuart Davis to come be a juror for the next biennial. And Stuart Davis is one of the jurors who then chooses Benjamin Wigfall's painting. And not only chooses it, but in the press they're very clear that the three-person jury was unanimous on choosing Benjamin Wigfall and that they thought he held great promise as an American artist. And so he was attending Hampton University when that painting was acquired. He was still a student. And this is another painting he made 1 year later in 1952 at Hampton, which was acquired by Hampton before or in the year that he graduated in 1953. Again, just emphasizing what a remarkable artist he was, that these institutions were recognizing him at such a young age. And his chair, the chair of the art department at Hampton University, wrote an incredible letter of recommendation after Benjamin Wigfall had a painting in the collection here when he was applying for his third fellowship, which he ended up getting as an anonymous fellowship. Leo Katz wrote this letter talking about how Benjamin Wigfall didn't stop and try to repeat himself after winning an award. Instead, he really pushed forward with experimentation, and I think you see that through the rest of his career. He never sat still. He was always moving forward, trying experiments and seeing what the next thing was going to be. And this is why this letter is so beautiful. This is the quote that opens the exhibition. It's hard to say if he lives in art or if art lives in him. And the year that he received the anonymous fellowship, he received recognition along with the fellowship winners, which included Cy Twombly, who has gone on, of course, to become one of the main or a prime example of mid-century abstraction, a part of the avant-garde in the 1950s, and really embraced by Virginia as one of our great artists. And so one of the clear projects of this exhibition, and seeing the two of them juxtaposed makes it even clearer, is that I hope that with this story we can claim Benjamin Wigfall also as not just a Virginia artist, but as an artist who has made a major contribution to American art. I can stop there, but I'm going to keep going. I've got a lot more slides. So from Hampton, he graduated. He went to Iowa State for 1 year. And then he attended Yale University beginning in 1954, which is where we think he made these two prints. And I'm showing them to you because you're looking at a wood block on one side and the print on the other, but that's actually the same wood block. So it has a figurative work on one side and it has an abstraction on the other side. And this is one of the wonderful things about having the archive. This means that we have this object, it's in the exhibition, and you can see how he was working simultaneously. And at first I had thought that most likely, we all kind of had thought most likely that this figurative work came earlier and that the abstract work came later, but in working with our conservators, who were looking at some stencils he was using at the time for both, he was likely making them at the same time. So in 1954, he was still kind of thinking about both ways of making work. But from 1955 forward, he really only worked in an abstract mode. And this is another incredible gift of the archive. This is Benjamin Wigfall with the composition in the Yale Design Studio. And Yale University actually has acquired this print, so they have the same, they acquired it in 1954 when he was a student there. And this is another example of a print he made at Yale, which is where he began to make a significant shift from painting to printmaking under the mentorship of Gabor Peterdy, who was a printmaker, a European emigre printmaker who was one of the figures responsible for the Renaissance in printmaking in mid-20th century America. And this is another photograph of him at the design in the Yale studio, which we originally thought Gino was at Hampton because Gino remembered the printing press. But then I did a little search for Yale Design Studio, and you see those triangular ceiling, that architecture is actually a Louis Kahn architecture at Yale. So we were able to date the photographs from that time period. And then he left Yale after a year. He returned and finished his degree in 1959, but in 1955 he came back to be a professor at Hampton University. And while he was at Hampton, he really received enormous recognition as an artist, not just as a Virginia artist, but as an American artist, as you can see here in Art in America. Two of his prints, which he made at Yale, that are being featured. Which is then what leads to the really jarring aspect of the story, which we know about because of the Hampton script. And this story, I'll back up a little bit, is where I enter into understanding the larger context for Benjamin Wigfall at VMFA. In 2016, a community member, Linda Holmes, reached out to me. She was working in Hampton, and she was working on a project on the sit-ins in 1960, and specifically the Hampton University students who participated in the sit-ins in 1960. And so she was reading the Hampton script. And she was reading it, the whole volume, 1957 to 1963, and she came across this article about Benjamin Wigfall. And she emailed me to ask if we had a work by Benjamin Wigfall in the collection because of the ending of the article, which states that when he was falsely arrested in front of the Miller and Rhodes department store in 1957, a painting in the VMFA's collection was on view. So I knew we had a painting by Benjamin Wigfall. I'd shown one of them, but I knew about an earlier one because of Tasha Grantham, who'd been a curator here before me, who had done a program and invited Benjamin Wigfall down for an interview in 2003. But I couldn't find anything in the archive or any kind of record about his being arrested. And so we happened to have a fund that had just been given that could only be spent on interviewing visiting artists, interviewing living artists. So I told Linda we needed to go to New Paltz and we needed to interview Benjamin Wigfall. And I think because he had been so warmly received by Tasha Grantham, who had brought him here in 2003, he agreed to let us come to New Paltz and to ask him about this, as well as the rest, talk to him about the rest of his career. And it's it's a truly awful story about a false arrest in 1957 in the context of massive resistance. So 1954 is Brown versus Board of Education. Virginia then decides that it is going to be the seat of the legal fight against integration, which is why it's massive resistance to integration. And so in the midst of that, I think you can imagine the rhetoric goes up, but also the surveillance and the enforcement of segregation also increases. And as the article makes clear, there's not a real good reason for why they arrested him. And in fact, he made clear in his interview with Linda and I that they tackled him. It was plainclothes police officers who tackled him in front of the Miller and Rhodes department store and then really couldn't articulate a reason for why he was being arrested. He pushed against that arrest. They said that if it's all of this is coming from this Hampton script article, that if he continued to protest, they would book him. And he said, fine, then book me because I did nothing wrong. And so he was taken to the jail, according to the article and to our interview. And at that point, Oliver Hill became his lawyer. So for those of you in Virginia who know the story of Oliver Hill, he was one of the lawyers. That's good. Go ahead, clap. Oliver Hill was one of the lawyers for on the Brown versus Board of Education case. And one of the more humorous ways in which, if there is humor in this story, he talked about it was the fact that your father said, I don't think Oliver Hill thought I was much. But when he stood up in court, Wigfall recalled that a bunch of people from Hampton University stood up with him, and Oliver Hill said, "You didn't tell me who you were." But part of the, what helps tell that story is a letter we have in the archive from Hampton Institute, which was Alonzo Moran, who was president of the university, writing to the president, or the owner of Miller and Rhodes, reminding him, because he was the president of VMFA's board. So the owner of Miller and Rhodes, where he was arrested, was the president of the board of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in 1957 when he was arrested. And so Alonzo Moran, the president of Hampton University, is reminding Rhodes that he had a part in awarding him his fellowships. So we have this letter. What we don't have is any kind of written record of VMFA standing with Benjamin Wigfall. We do know that the very next year, in 1958, he has a painting acquired in the American Biennial. So his first painting, Chimneys, came in the Virginia Biennial. 1958, he jumps scale to American painting, and he has Corrosion and Blue acquired, and he painted it in 1957. So we don't get to know when in 1957 he painted it, but I found it really profound that he talked about, in this particular painting, he talked about how he was searching for a way to make a work that was beyond images, not even beyond words, but beyond images, to give shape to his experiences. And so this work is about decay and rust and kind of natural phenomenon, but it is difficult for me, as much as he didn't make a concrete link, not to think about its association in 1957. And then it wins an award, and it comes in with some of the finest abstract expressionist paintings we have at VMFA. And anybody who knows that I wrote my dissertation on Hedda Stern, I love the fact that it came in with Hedda Stern's painting in 1958. I have to throw that slide in there. But also with an Adolf Gottlieb painting and a number. So he's really also at his height as an artist. And it's in 1958 that Leslie Cheek, the director of the museum, commissions him to make the Christmas card for the museum. So every year he asked one Virginia artist to make a card. And the other reason I think that's significant is that even though we don't have any record that that the museum made a statement about the arrest, we also know that in 1958, VMFA got in trouble, essentially, for having integrated receptions. So the museum had tried to request from the state more space out of what was the Confederate Memorial Park. And they were denied that request in court when the United Daughters of the Confederacy were there with Confederate flags and were protesting the fact that VMFA was holding integrated classes and receptions. In the news, VMFA stated they did not hold integrated classes, which was true. They had segregated classes, but they did not deny that they were holding integrated receptions. And we also know that from the letters to the editor that were sent back. One, Miss Joyce Kleitz, who said something to the effect of, "So VMFA holds integrated receptions, so what? May I remind you that the South lost the war?" So, there we go. It's a much better, and if you read the catalog, it's a beautiful letter. But I also think it's remarkable that Leslie Cheek then chose Benjamin Wigfall to make the card for the museum that year. I don't think that in any way, I don't think a lost parking lot at any way is at all close to a false arrest. But I do think it was an acknowledgement in some way that he was going to promote an African-American artist in the midst of this increased surveillance of segregation in the state, but then here as a state agency. And this was the alternate design that Benjamin Wigfall made for the Christmas card, the one Leslie Cheek didn't choose, but the one that we used, Alex, for the New Year's card this year, in acknowledgement of the fact that Benjamin Wigfall had written to Leslie Cheek that this was his preferred design. And it's very related to the works that we were able to acquire and that are in the exhibition. So you can see this assemblage with that incredible blue. It's an ultramarine blue, but we're calling it Wigfall blue. And then you can see the ways in which his assemblage practice and his printmaking continue together. And then he talked about the way that these assemblages, particularly his burning technique, were a merging of painting and printmaking. And this is a work that's at the close of the exhibition. It's particularly stunning. You kind of have to see it. The image doesn't do it justice, but each one of those is a burn mark. And in fact, Gino's talked about just the physical endurance it required to make those marks, and you can imagine the smell of the burning, but it's very much like the etching process, which is why I put those together. It's a similar kind of technique as you would have in etching a metal plate, as in burning the wood, but again, using that blue and using paint on these wood panels. And it's about this time, around 1963, that Benjamin Wigfall decides to leave Hampton University. He applies to a number of places, and he decides on the State University of New York, New Paltz, where he becomes specifically a printmaking professor. So he really shifts his medium from painting to printmaking formally at that point. And at the same time, in the 1960s, he grows interested in thinking about ways to root his practice more in the Black community. And in part, he talked about that, especially in an interview with his father, James Andrew Wigfall, who visited in 1968, and he recorded a conversation with him, and that recording became the basis of a whole new technique he came up with. He called it his audiographic system, where he recorded the conversation, he transcribed it word for word, and then he translated it into prints. He wanted these prints to then be shown at the same time as the audio was played from the recording, so that you could hear the voice as you saw the print. And we've done that in the exhibition. When you get into the middle, you can press a button and you can hear the voice of his father. But that really kicked off for him, that conversation, this idea that New Paltz was a profoundly white community, and so while VMFA had been a very white institution, he had been grounded in a Black community, and at Hampton, of course, it was a historically Black college, but at New Paltz, he was the only Black faculty member, and he wanted to find a way to root his own practice in the African American community. So he went looking for a neighborhood, and he found one in Kingston, in the Pankaki neighborhood of Kingston, where he thought that he was just going to be establishing his studio. But then the kids in the neighborhood started helping him to fix it up, and then it just became organically, in fact, a community. He called it a community think tank, a printmaking space, an art center, a place for education and mentorship. But at the heart of that really was this role of recording the voices of the community. And that's something that the students themselves remember and talked about, that he would go to the elders in the community. Those were their grandparents quite often, and even sometimes their parents, and he would record their conversations, he would make art out of them, and he would encourage the students themselves to take photographs, which really encouraged them to value their own elders' stories. So this is an image of him in the church across the street recording. We just received this photograph of one of the other subjects, Mango. So you'll see several prints in the show titled Mango, which was Mr. Kirk from the neighborhood. And then again, he was showing these specifically at Communications Village as part of the presentations they would make. So this is the building, Communications Village, that he thought would be his studio. And at this point, I'm going to speed up so we can get to the question and answer. But what he found there at Communications Village was in fact actually a Virginian community and a community also from the Carolinas. He'd found out from his father in the late 60s that their family's roots actually were in Edgefield County, South Carolina, and then of course he grew up in Richmond, Virginia. And when he got to this Pankaki neighborhood within Kingston, many of the families had migrated from Virginia and the Carolinas because of the Great Migration, there was looking for work, and there was a brick factory in Kingston. So this community around him also put him back into contact with the idea of his childhood, and he talked very specifically about how much Kingston reminded him of Church Hill, and that this was really an immersing himself back into the culture of his childhood. And this is where we saw so many connections between the story of Communications Village and the story of his growing up in Richmond, Virginia. And this is his poster, which you will see blown up to 12 feet tall in the exhibition, which is wonderful because it serves as the guide for the rest of the exhibition. Not only does it contain his definition, which was very avant-garde, of what he thought Communications Village was, a place where traditional art and daily lived experiences could merge into kind of one art form, but also the incredible number of visiting artists he was bringing from New York, including Benny Andrews, Betty Blayton, who was from Virginia, Melvin Edwards, Jane Cortez, Charles Gaines, Ernie Critchlow, Bob Blackburn, Mavis Pusey. These are major names from this time period, and he was inviting them not just to come make a print at Communications Village, but to engage with the community. And he wrote about that in the Intaglio print editions, the specificity of his visiting art program. He wanted these, what he called outstanding Black artists, he wanted them to be making art specifically about this community, to come out of this community, and he wanted the community to see and appreciate their art. And this is one of his quotes from what he wrote in the Intaglio print editions. So these are just some examples then, which you'll see downstairs, of prints that were made at Communications Village. Charles Gaines, an incredible conceptual artist. And then we've paired them with works in our own, in VMFA's collection, by these artists. One quick shout out to Valerie, which is that when she arrived here, she identified Charles Gaines, Betty Blayton, Melvin Edwards. These were major acquisition priorities for her because she saw them as important artists nationally, internationally, to be a part of our collection, to tell our story. So she chose this work, working with Oscar Blayton, I see over there, to represent Betty Blayton. And then it was incredible to find the print that Betty Blayton actually made at Communications Village, which has the same shape, the same cobalt purple. So just this beautiful confluence between the community that Benjamin Wigfall brought together, affirmed by Valerie Cassell Oliver's incredible taste and understanding of the artists of this time period. And very similarly, Melvin Edwards' piece, Corner for Anna, which we'll have a program about on July 13th, I think. And you can see the ways in which Melvin Edwards, who had this very piece in the Whitney in 1970, used barbed wire in the print he made at Communications Village. And then a poem that his partner Jane Cortez wrote, inspired by the community in Pankaki in Kingston, which is merged then with the Mel Edwards print. Artists like Benny Andrews, who, again, also a major artist from the time period, but he was making specific portraits of the youth in the neighborhood, which they remember really well. The students remember sitting at a table, it was just a plain old table, while he made this drawing of them, and found it incredible the way it was transformed. So this is the opening in September at the Dorsky, Dina and Teresa showing and remembering this print. Mavis Pusey did not make a print. She ended up in Virginia for the last 30 years of her career. She did not make a print, but she gave an incredible artist talk, which Benjamin Wigfall recorded, and you can hear an excerpt in the exhibition, telling the kids the theme, I think, that Benjamin Wigfall wanted to get out there, which was, you do not need to leave your own community to make art. You can make art out of your own community, and you just need to look around you and see what's in front of you, and to expand the way you're seeing. Work by Pat Zhao, who was a student of his at SUNY New Paltz, and then who became an educator at Communications Village and made her own incredible prints. You can see this one. Joe Ramos, another faculty member at SUNY New Paltz. Benjamin Wigfall making a print there. Love the fact that the students themselves made the letterpress posters. that advertised the classes that they were taking at Communications Village, which is a key aspect, really, of this project. The students, Benjamin Wigfall and the other teachers trained the students to make the prints themselves, and they were paid to do this. So it became not just art classes, but apprenticeships in printmaking and in art. And I wanted to use this last slide to thank Gia and Gino for letting us tell this story. We are so honored that you wanted your father's legacy to be here at VMFA, and so I will end with a thank you to you. Thanks.